So welcome everybody to another installment of the Ide Seminar. We've got a really exciting seminar today with Alan Davidson. Really important topic about what the impact of the 2020 election might be in terms of implications for the digital economy. I've also kind of twisted his arm to talk about the recent Mozilla activities trying to put Facebook and Twitter's feet to the fire with regard to the election and their policies, and allowed him the leeway to caveat that. And these views do not reflect the views of my employer or the organization to which I'm a senior advisor, et cetera. But that should be very interesting. So let me do a quick formal introduction, but also remind you to please keep your videos and your microphones muted during the talk, just to reduce the amount of distraction that we might have. So Alan Davidson, he's a senior advisor to Mozilla, and he was previously Mozilla's VP of Global Policy, Trust and Security. He served in the Obama administration as the first director of the digital economy at the U.S. Department of Commerce, worked at Google's public policy office in Washington, D.C. So he's got really deep chops in terms of tech's relationship to public policy. And he's also an MIT alum, which is great for us, and a graduate of Yale Law School. And so today he's going to be talking about election 2020 preview, implications for the digital economy, and how the outcome of this election might affect the internet and the broader digital economy. I'm super curious about this, given there are so many open questions with regard to how we regulate the internet, from the Splinternet to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act to, antitrust, to all sorts of different platform regulation, privacy. Will we see a harmonization of state privacy laws in a federal privacy legislation? What about net neutrality, and so on? This is just such a fantastic opportunity. Alan, we really appreciate you being here, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that introduction. Let me see if I can make the screen sharing work. Give me a thumbs up if you've got it.
Great.
Excellent, great. And I'll just start by saying, yes, thank you for that welcome. And I will say I've been a long time supporter and affiliate and fan of the initiative and the Center for Digital Business, and it's really a delight to be here. And I'll also say I've really appreciated over time the work of this group, particularly when I was in government. We really relied on it, leaned on some of the work that had come out of the IDE, and I really discovered a newfound appreciation for it. So it's great to be here. I will say, one of the little silver linings of COVID, very small, has been that this group has been doing its lunch meetings online. So it's been great to be able to join in when I can. And I will say, a little bit after having watched probably most of the talks this semester, I'm tempted to start with that old Monty Python line, and now for something completely different. I'm not an academic. I'm not an economist. I am a practitioner in the field, and have had a bunch of different executive positions, and so delighted to at least share a view of what we may have ahead of us, depending on what happens with this election. So with that, I'll definitely also make the caveat that was said before. I'm here speaking purely in my own personal capacity, and these views don't represent those of Mozilla or any campaign or any other group I might be working with, but I'm delighted to share them with you all here. So let's give this a try. Sorry. So in terms of agenda, we'll talk about a couple of different things. One is just a quick, walk through the 2020 election right now, the state of the race, particularly the presidential race, but also looking quickly at some of the other important races that are going on, including in the Senate, the House of Representatives, some of the state races. Then I'll spend some time talking about, what are the implications for the digital economy and some of the topics that we were just mentioning, platform regulation, privacy, and more. And we'll end with just a little segment on what I think of as transition integrity, the questions that have been coming up about what happens after the election and will we have a peaceful transition of power in the US? What's the role of social media in particular in there? Because there's been a lot going on in that space. I'll just say I really encourage everybody to ask questions. I am not an awesome Zoom multitasker, but if anybody, if any of our hosts wanted to monitor the chat and chime in with a question, I'm delighted to take them during the talk, and then also we'll save some time at the end for sure for questions. So please fire away. So the 2020 election, if you've been reading the news lately in the United States, you've seen that we have a big election coming up. There's a lot on this November 3rd ballot. And I should say, by the way, I know that some of you spend a lot of time reading about and thinking about some of these things. And I'm sure that some of you also feel like life is too short to spend a lot of time reading about or thinking about these things. So I'm going to try and walk through it very quickly and calibrate somewhere in between, and including for those of us who may not even be from the US and familiar with all the pieces of the system, but I'll give you the overview. Big election this year. President Trump is up for re-election against Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as vice president. We also have a little over a third of the Senate up for re-election. All 435 members of the House of Representatives, as we do every 2 years. And like every election, there are also a lot of what we call down ballot races in the states, state legislatures, and some ballot initiatives that are going to be really impactful in terms of the issues that we all think about in terms of the digital economy. You can't start a conversation with this without acknowledging that this is an election like few others, probably unique from anything that any of us have ever seen. I mean, the level of crisis that's facing the country and any new administration that comes in. Obviously, COVID-19 is foremost on people's minds. We also have a related economic crisis, high levels of unemployment, real uncertainty about the future, and a nationwide grappling and reckoning with systemic racism in our country in a way that we haven't seen in quite a while. And that's actually really impacting the electorate at both ends of the political spectrum, really reacting to and motivated by the Black Lives Matter movement. In that context, then, and I should say the other factor here that is really the Trump factor. We have a president who's really been unlike any that we've seen before, or at least in modern memory, and that is both a feature and a bug for some people in the electorate. And but he certainly kind of has an outsized role and voice in this election all across the ballot, not just in the presidency. So I'll start with the race for president, and probably folks who follow these things have seen a lot of these kinds of maps. In the US, we do not elect purely based on the popular vote across the country. We have an electoral college system, and where different states are assigned different different amounts of votes, and it's a race to 270. There's 538 total electoral votes. It's a race to see who can get 270 electoral votes. And what that means in our current system is that the race actually, despite what you hear in the polls about, Joe Biden being ahead in the national polls or anything like that, what it really comes down to is a small set of states that are going to be what we view as what people call the battleground states, a small set of states where the outcomes are likely to tip. There's a whole set of states where the outcomes are really, folks are fairly confident. We know that Maryland, where I live, and outside of the Washington, D.C. suburbs, we know that that's going to be blue. It's going to be a Joe Biden state. I think we feel confident that Wyoming will be a Donald Trump state. But there's a whole set of states in the middle. This map kind of gives an indication, at least one view of it. There's a lot of these different maps out there, by the way. If you're interested, there's a ton of great sources out there. I got this from Real Clear Politics. 270 to win. I use some of their maps later. You'll see. There's lots of places you can go out and try out your own map and see what happens if if Florida goes to Trump or to Biden, and how things play out. We have this is Real Clear Politics based on their latest polling as of yesterday. A look at what they see as the battleground states, the ones that are not red or blue here. You can see there's some pretty important ones. Florida's got a big set of electoral votes. Pennsylvania has gotten a lot of attention. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania were the states that put Donald Trump over the finish line in 2016, so they get a lot of attention. But there are a lot of states that are up for grabs here, and that's part of what has gotten where a lot of the energy is now focused, and that's why you hear people talking about those battleground states all the time. If we look at the current state of play in some of those states, the polling right now seems to indicate that Joe Biden's got a lead in most of the important states. If you look at, again, this is from Real Clear Politics, their consensus look at the battleground states and their consensus polling, that's kind of an average of recent polls, shows. And in each of these, you see Joe Biden up by what are in some cases like Michigan, significant margins. And that's important for the election because, I think if you had to say whose shoes would you rather be in right now, Biden does look like he's got significant leads in more ways to win, more ways to get to that 270 than Donald Trump has. If you look and see at where the kind of sure votes for Trump are, and then what he needs to do in order to be able to get to 270, it's starting to feel a little bit more like pulling an inside straight. It really needs to win probably Florida, Arizona, and then a few of these, one or two of these others at least, to get within striking distance. So right now, at least, and we're 13 days away from this election, many people are feeling like this is a good-looking map for Biden. And in fact, if you went to the Real Clear Politics and asked them to do what, kind of, if there were no toss-ups, what if you just believed exactly what the polls were telling you today, what would this look like? And it would look like a pretty sizable Biden win. 357 electoral votes, which would be, actually viewed as a landslide in our modern electoral politics, where presidential races have been really close. At the same time, I guess there's still a lot of anxiety and a lot of questions about what the results will be, for a bunch of different reasons. And there's a probably in this space a really wide mistrust maybe of polling, in part because our experience from 2016, where at this stage of the election, many people were saying the same thing about Hillary Clinton's chances against Donald Trump, and expecting her to win, and in fact, she did not. So this is a great little graph from the New York Times that just looks at average polling leads in presidential elections month by month, and for the most part, the leads were sustained, although Clinton versus Trump is really quite a bit of an outlier, and really pollsters did miss that. There are reasons to feel a little bit more confident if you're the Biden team right now, but there are these questions out there. Does Trump underpoll? Do people not like to admit that they're voting for him? There were a lot of issues in 2016 with not capturing the electorate properly, and really missing who a lot of the Trump voters are. Like I say, there's a lot of reasons to feel confident. If you're Biden right now, the lead is much greater than we saw for Hillary Clinton. Another big mitigating factor here is early voting. As of last night, over 35 million people in America have voted already in this election, whether it's through mail-in balloting or early voting that's been created, particularly because of reaction to COVID. That's more than 20% of the expected voting population this year. So a lot of the votes are already in. And, so there's a feeling that even if there are late changes tightening up, that perhaps this is a durable lead for Biden. The other kind of mitigating factor here on the other side is that anything can happen in 13 days. We have a debate tomorrow, and also mail-in balloting is much more prevalent this year, but it's also much more susceptible to mistakes and to challenges. You may have even heard recent stories like in Pennsylvania, you're required to have a privacy envelope inside here, and many people were mailing them in without their ballot in the privacy envelope, and they're not going to be accepting those ballots. So there's lots of ways that people can make mistakes with their signatures, with what they're required to do for mail-in ballots, and with so many coming in, there's a lot of questions about what will happen with those. Let me walk quickly through some of the other races that are going to be important, and then we'll get to the conversation about the digital economy impact. The Senate. The Senate is it's one of our two bodies of our legislature. 100 members, 35 of them are up for re-election this year. It's extremely important, and it is going to be important for some of these issues that we care about. First of all, you need the Senate to be able to, if you want to, they approve laws. So with the House of Representatives, which is currently in the hands of Democrats, the question of whether we'll have divided government or one-party government rests in the Senate. They also confirm judges, which is a huge thing, and also treaties. These are going to be big things in some of the big issues that we have coming up. The race for the Senate is super interesting because this year, just through the vagaries of sort of how this came up, of how seats come up, 23 of the 35 seats that are up for re-election this year are in the hands of Republicans. So the Republicans have a lot of turf to defend. Democrats have a lot less, and so there's an opportunity to pick up. Right now, the Democrats have 47 votes in the Senate, and so they need a pickup of 4 to get to a clear majority, 51. Actually, if Biden wins, they would only need 3 because the tiebreaker is the vice president. So that's the magic number for Democrats to be able to take control of the Senate, and that's what the Republicans are focused on defending. This is a 270 to win, great website if you're looking for these kinds of electoral maps. This is kind of their look at where the big undecided races are. And you can see this kind of mirrors a lot of the presidential race, but there are some differences. And we have big, toss-up races in places like North Carolina, Iowa, Montana, and others, and other places where Democrats look like they're building a commanding lead. So just to give you a quick sense of it, and we could love to talk. I could talk about the details of this stuff. There for forever. There's tons of interesting races going on right now. The Alabama race is an example. It's one that's the Democrats are almost surely going to lose. But Arizona, Colorado, and Maine are places where Democrats are looking like they have comfortable leads to pick up a seat, including astronaut Mark Kelly, who's here in the picture, who's likely to win in Arizona, be a new senator there. And we have and a new senator coming from New England State, Maine, possibly Sarah Gideon, who looks like she has a pretty good lead. But there are these other races that are very close. So I think if you were a betting person, and the prediction markets probably are indicating right now that Democrats do look like they have a very solid chance. But again, a lot of these races are tightening, and lots can happen in the last 2 weeks, including, just an example in North Carolina, there was a scandal involving the Democratic candidate, and that's probably really cut into his lead, for example. The House is one that's probably a lot easier to call, honestly. The Democrats have a commanding majority of 21 seats in that the Republicans would need to pick up, and this is trending the opposite way for Republicans right now. And so the expectations are that even right now, just looking at 229 seats, again, this is 270 to win, looking at their consensus polling, they would say 229 of the 217 needed for a majority, 218 needed for a majority, are safely in Democratic hands, and there's a bunch of toss-ups out there. So I think, if anything, the expectation is that Democrats will have even more of a majority in the House in the coming year. In the states, this is actually kind of high stakes. We don't really talk about state legislative races all that often. It's something that, is very local in terms of its politics. Every state has a legislature in the US. They set state laws. But one of the important things that states do is they also every 10 years, they're involved in redistricting the states, and that's deciding the voting boundaries within the states. We have this incredible system of gerrymandering in the U.S. where we contort our voting districts to, for the party in power uses it as a way to continue to solidify their majorities. It's not really a healthy practice, and I think there'll be big opportunities to address it if state legislatures flip in places like North Carolina or Pennsylvania, maybe even Texas, where you'll see Democrats making big inroads there. For our purposes, one of the most interesting things at the state level is like what's happening with these ballot initiatives. And California continues to be kind of an amazing place to watch because they have a process for doing ballot questions. It makes it possible to put very important issues on the ballot in front of the electorate. This year, they've got two that are worthy of our attention for sure. One is the California Privacy Rights and Enforcement Act. It's a new, it would go even further. California has sort of probably one of the strongest privacy laws in the US right now among states. And this would go even further and create quite a kind of expand the regulatory regime there. It's quite controversial among some of the tech companies out there, but a lot of consumer advocates are pushing for it. So that's going to be a big one to watch. The other is around gig workers. California Proposition 22 is being pushed by Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, and others. It would basically make it clear that their app economy workers, their gig workers, are to be treated as independent contractors and not as employees with all the rights and benefits of employees. So that's another big one to watch, and it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out. That'll have a big impact on those. Have a big impact on those companies, but also these things, especially California is such a giant economy. Many companies aren't really able to make, I'd say this from Mozilla's experience, we don't really make a huge distinction between who's a California user and who's a not California user. So even one state can have a really big impact on how companies act with regards to their users everywhere. So that's probably a bigger issue for the privacy ballot initiative. We'll see what happens with the gig worker one. And I actually haven't seen great recent polling on those, so I'm not sure. I think they're both pretty up in the air. Okay, pause if anybody wants to jump in with questions, but we'll save most of them for the end. So I'll just keep going through here. So what does this all mean for the election? I mean, for our digital economy. Let me just start. I love this picture because to me it's really symbolic of what we face, what the internet, the major internet companies face today. We're entering an era, and many people have talked about it, about the techlash. Really, an era of much greater scrutiny and regulation, particularly around the largest tech companies. And I think part of it is just exactly what we might have all foreseen, which is the internet's really an important part of people's lives. And so it's natural that government will care more than it did 10 or 15 years ago when a lot of these issues were kind of more speculative for people. I think it's also really a function of the behavior of some of the larger companies, not all of whom have been as sensitive to consumer concerns around things like privacy, security, how they regulate and moderate content on their platform. And because of this, I think we're seeing around the world, and particularly in Washington, D.C. now, a greater appetite for doing more. And I will also say that, and I say this also partly from the perspective of somebody who had a smaller company who works with other small companies and medium-sized companies, there's a little bit of a sense that maybe the big guys are ruining it for the rest of us. There's a lot of anger out there at some of the large companies. Facebook's a good example, and that's really driving the conversation among regulators about what to do. And so I think there's going to be regardless of who wins the election, expect more action in this space. So just looking at tech policy, where we are today and where we're likely to be next year, I will say that internet policy has tended to be historically pretty bipartisan. We like to say, people on both sides of the aisle care about privacy and care about security. It's true, Republicans, Democrats care about these things, and because people care about these things. There have been notable exceptions, and those kinds of exceptions are becoming more of the rule. Net neutrality is a great example of an issue that has had a real partisan divide between Republicans and Democrats for a while. And those kinds of issues, and more importantly, the approaches that different parties have started to take towards different issues are what really make this election more important than any that we've seen in terms of how it'll impact the digital economy. A couple of different scenarios to consider that we'll talk about. One is something that people call the blue wave, which is where not only does the presidency go to Joe Biden, but where Democrats retain the House and actually take the Senate. That would be the kind of biggest Democratic swing. You could also imagine split scenarios where, for example, Joe Biden wins the presidency, but the Republicans retain the Senate. Or even where there's a Trump presidency and a Democratic Senate, which is probably less likely. But probably those split governance possibilities are quite real. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the big internet policy issues, particularly where the election is going to have implications. And I'll just say, as a couple, just a quick caveat, there are other broad areas which I really won't talk about too much about, including things like tax policy or healthcare, where the outcome of the election will have a pretty big impact. There are very different plans between those, in terms of these the campaigns and the Democratic or House Senate. But I'm going to focus more on the what I think of as the digital policy, the internet policy issues, platform accountability, privacy, antitrust, where we're going to see a real impact on a lot of the companies that we think about in the digital economy. I'll also just say, recognize that regardless of who wins, COVID is definitely the animating issue, and the first 100-day plan for a Joe Biden administration and probably for a second Trump administration is all about that, because you can't make progress on anything until you make progress on that issue. So let me say a few words about platform accountability. So this is really kind of as the backdrop for this is, there really is growing dissatisfaction across the spectrum, political spectrum, I'd say, with what people see as a rising tide of illegal content online, harmful content, which might not be illegal, but is worrying of people, things like misinformation, harassment online. And while we started to see an uptick in regulation outside of the US, there's still very little regulation in the US around this, and in part, driven by our First Amendment and our commitment to free expression. That does not feel like a sustainable place today. And I think you're seeing Republicans and Democrats who really there's tremendous agreement on the fact that tech platforms, particularly the large tech companies, need to be regulated. I have to say, as somebody who used to work at Google, this is really a sea change, and it's got to be a worrying thing if you're at one of those companies, because it's rare to see this level of animosity and bipartisan animosity focused at one industry. This is like cigarettes. This is like maybe big pharma or seatbelts. I think that this is it's rare to see this level of intensity. Of course, what's a little weird about it is that the Republicans and Democrats may agree on wanting to do something, but the things that are motivating them in some ways are almost in direct opposition. So you have, for example, in the misinformation space, Republicans quite concerned about what they perceive as conservative bias among large tech platforms. At the same time, you have Democrats who are incredibly worried and concerned about conservative news sources that are promoting misinformation, and that the platforms aren't doing enough to stop that. So we have, while we have a lot of interest in doing something. The what the something is a big question mark still. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is the rule that gives liability protections to intermediaries, everybody from ISPs to Facebook, not responsible for the content that they do not originate, if they're the conduit of that content. That rule is really getting a huge amount of attention. And I would argue actually maybe too much attention, because there are a lot of other things that may be much more fruitful in terms of addressing the problems that we see. And actually, I think a lot of the changes to Section 230 might have may have the opposite effect of what some of the people who are seeking them are hoping for. Regardless, I think if there is a blue wave in particular, you're going to see more pressure for accountability and a greater likelihood of legislation. You know, we like to say in Washington, personnel is policy. That the people that you put into positions make a big difference in terms of what actually happens. I think you'll see a Biden administration really push, for example, for people at the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, who are really sensitive to these issues and will be much more aggressive in enforcement against large tech companies. There have been calls out there for a new tech regulator, whether it's at the FTC or a whole new, you know, kind of internet agency to go look at these issues. I think you'll also see greater ad transparency around ads and rules. Perhaps, you know, there's something in the current Congress called the Honest Ads Act, which hasn't made progress but could really make progress in a blue wave scenario, where you would have a mandate that advertising be transparent. You know, all ads will be something that could be seen. It's certainly political ads, and maybe all advertising would have to be transparent. There'd be ad libraries that everybody could look at and see where ads are being served. And there's legislation that's been introduced now, and I think would have a much greater chance of making progress, particularly if there's a unified, I would say, a blue wave, a unified Congress. A Trump presidency is not a pass at all in this space. I think you'll see, if anything, like an even greater focus on the anti-conservative bias that's seen among the social media platforms, and trying to use every tool in the toolkit to try and do something about that. One of the big wild cards here is it's actually pretty hard to legislate in this area in the United States, and I think that no matter what happens, you know, some of these, especially if there's legislation, you could expect litigation around it, challenges under the First Amendment. Europe may end up being the leader here again, and that's another thing to watch out for. They're moving very aggressively with their Digital Services Act to try and regulate platform moderation and accountability, and they may, just as they were in privacy, turn out to be a leader here. So that's something else to watch. Second big issue where I think you'll see a difference is around privacy. You know, the backstory here is just growing concern about privacy among consumers everywhere, and their security to related issue. And amazingly, the United States really still has no baseline data protection law. And the mechanism we've used to regulate privacy so far, which is really based on notice and consent, the idea of putting out big privacy notices that people then consent to, I think many people feel like it's just totally broken. And this is an area where the lack of action in the US over the last 20 years has created a void, actually, globally. And Europe has stepped into it. The GDPR, the privacy regulation in Europe, is now the de facto standard, I think, around the world for governments that are looking at you know, what kind of privacy legislation to put in place. One of the most, you know, every year people ask me, like, what's going to happen in Congress this year? And it's really the most well-worn prediction that everybody has said probably for the last decade has been, this is the year Congress is going to pass a privacy law. And, you know, for the last decade, everybody's been wrong about that. I think, you know, that said, this could be the year, or like this could be the Congress 2021, 2022 for privacy legislation. And I will say, I think you could expect a Biden presidency is going to be much more aggressive on privacy enforcement. Again, it's about people, so you can expect FTC leadership that's going to be very much more aggressive on enforcing the rules we do have on the books. I think you would imagine a greater likelihood, particularly in a blue wave, of an aggressive privacy law. And I think you'll see more action in what I like to think of as verticals, specific areas where rulemaking could go into, could be used, or you might see new law around children's privacy, health privacy, student records, IoT devices and security standards there, financial data. Each of those, I think, is ripe for more attention, and I think you definitely see more of it in a blue wave. That said, I think that a privacy law is needed, especially as states start to go out there. We talked about the California ballot initiative. There's a growing incentive to do something, because a patchwork of state laws is not good for industry either. So you've got a growing combination of regulators who want to do more, Congress people who are trying to react to the public, and companies who are realizing this actually might be good for business. Another area to look out for is network neutrality. This is an area where we've had probably over a decade of pendulum swings within the Federal Communications Commission, our telecom regulator, over rules that would prohibit ISPs from blocking or throttling or putting paid prioritization in place for internet traffic. This is probably the clearest area where you could feel some certainty about a difference between the candidates. The current FCC under President Trump has rolled back the Obama open internet orders was challenged in court and actually upheld. Mozilla was actually the lead plaintiff in that case, so we were sorry to see that outcome. But one outcome of that case was that it also said that there was a green light. It appeared to give a green light to states to regulate. So you're going to see more state regulation, I think, coming in this area if the federal government doesn't regulate. A Biden FCC will almost surely reinstate those open internet protections. And I think probably the most interesting question is whether a blue wave or even a split system would maybe give us something that we've been needing for a while, which is a law that basically is passed by Congress that just settles this once and for all. And there's probably a very good compromise to be had out there around this, but we just haven't reached it yet. Another thing that I think you would see in a Biden administration is some real work on broadband access. There's a big joke in Washington about, is it infrastructure week yet? Because for the last year we've had, or not last year, last 4 years, there's not a month goes by where it's not supposed to be infrastructure week. This is the week we're going to get an infrastructure bill, and it really hasn't come together. I think a Biden administration would, I know a Trump administration would say they want to do this. A Biden administration, I think, increases the likelihood of a big infrastructure package, and particularly one that it would include a lot of money for broadband access, which people, particularly in the COVID era, are finding a necessity. Antitrust is another great one. And by the way, I should say each of these, we could, these are topics that you could spend an hour talking about each of them. I'm trying to give you the quick overview here. I will say that antitrust, of course, in the papers this week with a big Justice Department lawsuit, real growing concern about the market power that's being exercised by some of the largest companies. And this is, again, something where both Republicans and Democrats, I think, are coming together on this idea that there's a level of dominance in their respective markets by Amazon, Apple, Google, and Facebook in particular. Notice, Microsoft isn't usually on that list, but I don't think you can completely let them off the hook. Real concern about those companies. And it's worth noting, like, each of them has really different problems. The issues that Google represents are really different than the concerns about Apple's use of the App Store, or how Amazon deals with third-party sellers, for example. And so they're all going to take different remedies and approaches, and Republicans, Democrats, that's where they really differ. And just as a great example, earlier this month, the House Democrats released a huge and really interesting report about antitrust, state of antitrust, and the 4 big tech companies. It was only signed by the Democrats. just this week, we saw a lawsuit by the Justice Department joined by 11 states, all Republican attorney generals, no Democrats. So there is a kind of a little bit of a partisan divide. That said, I think no matter who wins, there's going to be more aggressive legal action in this space. I'd expect more antitrust litigation, and Google was just the start. And this is, litigation that's going to extend for many years. These cases take years to decide. I think probably a Biden presidency has got a greater likelihood of depoliticizing it and working with some of the other Democratic state AGs. In either case, I think you're going to see much more scrutiny over M&A, like you've seen with the Google Fitbit deal, and a lot of a kind of a chilling effect on mergers for those big companies. I think it's just hard to see how Facebook is not going to buy another WhatsApp. That's just not going to happen anytime soon. And I think a blue wave would favor actually, kind of changes in the law, not just changes in the litigation. I will say, just as a reflection, we could talk about this more in the Q&A, like, a lot of people look at antitrust litigation as not a great solution in this space. It's criticized for being very slow, it's backward looking. That said, the threat of litigation can be a really important disciplining function. I'll say this as my experience working at Google in the kind of mid 2000s and late 2000s. It was not a secret that Google looked to the DOJ and to the states to help us with concerns about what Microsoft wanted to do. And I really do think this idea that, it is true, Microsoft would have strangled Google in its crib when it was much smaller, if it could have, but for the disciplining force of and the fear of regulation coming or litigation coming from the antitrust regulators. So that is very real. And the question of whether, even if the government doesn't win these lawsuits, does it have a beneficial effect is an interesting one. Of course, it also can chill innovation if we're not careful about it too. And so that'll be the argument that's made on the other side. So lots to see there. I want to make sure we got a couple minutes to get to the last piece of this, but I'll just say lots of other areas where there'll be differences. Relations with China is just really a big and interesting one. I think you'll see a Biden administration continuing to press China, but with a much more of a focus on human rights and much more of an approach that builds alliances with other countries. That was certainly something when I was at the Commerce Department, we worked quite a bit on. I think Trump will continue to be very aggressive in this regard. And it is an area where I think a lot of people in the industry feel that the Trump administration has called out something that needed to be called out, that this was just we've been overdue in addressing some of the bad behavior and the really uneven playing field in terms of being able to compete in China and the protectionism there, which I think all of us feel very, very acutely. Regardless who wins, I think that some of these issues don't go away, and they don't even become. They may get less political, but they don't go away. I won't dig in too far here. Encryption, I think, continues to be a big issue in both administrations. Maybe more sensitivity to privacy in a Biden administration. And one other thing I just focus on is that, I think a Biden presidency, you would see a kind of return to the love affair with tech that we saw in the Obama administration, and a real push to appoint senior leaders in departments, chief data officers, chief technology officers, to bring more tech talent into government and to really think about global leadership, multilateral leadership from the US. And I think those will be things that actually could have a big impact and be beneficial to the industry. And I think it's something that we've really stepped away from over the last 4 years, and particularly that emphasis on trying to bring tech talent in. I think something you'd see ramp up quite a bit. And then, I'd say regardless of who wins, there's a logjam in all of this. Privacy rules, Section 230. Almost regardless of who wins, there'll be more, but there'll be pretty important differences in the flavor of it and how regulatory it is. And different people will react different ways. Those have pluses. It's a feature and a bug, but there'll be real differences. The last thing I'll say, and then I want to make sure we have time for questions, is to talk a little bit about what happens after the election. So a lot of us are very accustomed to thinking about election day as a day, and then we go to, we stay up late at night and we find out the answers to who's won these elections, and maybe it's late at night, but we usually know who our president will be, who's won the important races that we care about locally. This year is going to be, again, a year unlike any others, and some of the factors to consider include that we have really an unprecedented amount of early voting happening, both by mail and in person, driven by COVID. We also have really different voting patterns and different by party, where you see Democrats who, 48% of Democrats, likely voters, said that they would vote by mail. Only 23%, less than half that number of Republicans expect to vote by mail. You also see really big different fears among voters, and this came out of some great work from the MIT Stanford election collaboration, where Democrats really fear COVID at the polls, and Republicans fear, mail-in ballots that are going to be lost. And you've also got a president who is already starting to signal that he might be unwilling to accept the results if he thinks that there's been fraud. So with all that, what could possibly go wrong? I was very lucky to be part of something called the Transition Integrity Project, a group of bipartisan political people and people from sort of a bunch of different walks who came together to game out different scenarios of what might happen between election day and inauguration day. And we looked at kind of war gamed out a bunch of different scenarios that's been written up in the media a little bit. And there were some really unsettling results from our war game exercises. And among them that were kind of most interesting are, we looked at different scenarios: a close Biden win, a close Trump win, landslides on both sides, a kind of indeterminate election. And I think one thing that was really clear to us was that we should expect an election week or election weeks, election month, maybe, not election night. The results of the election, it's possible that we'll know from some of the states, especially if there's a decisive win for either major candidate. But it's also quite likely we won't know. And I heard a wonderful presentation from the Washington Secretary of State, who talked about their experiences. They do all mail-in balloting, but in the primary, it took them almost a week to tally all of their mail-in ballots, in part because they have a rule where around postmarking that makes it that they really have to wait. These things are going to vary a lot state to state. And so I think, a determined campaign really has the opportunity to contest the election going into January. And I think the key thing there is to just plan for a contested election. Key dates in this process real quick: November 3rd is election day, but really the dates that people are going to start looking at are really in December, which are the deadlines for the Electoral College and the counting of electors. And then Congress will meet in January to certify those results. And you're going to hear a lot more about that than probably we ever usually do in these election scenarios. Social media and the election, I'll just say really quickly, social media is going to really have an outsized role in determining like those scenarios, how those scenarios play out. Mozilla has been really involved actually in trying to press social media companies to do a little bit more about misinformation and disinformation, along with many others. And I think you're going to see, and you're already seeing, some very aggressive tactics, more aggressive than we've ever seen from the social media companies, treating election-related misinformation a lot like they treat COVID misinformation, labeling removing accounts, and even doing it for political leaders. So I will just say this is going to be a fruitful area for us to look at for years to come, to see what actually happened here and how much of an effect it had. But right now, people are moving very fast, doing a lot of different things, and the hope is that it will have some. It'll make some help. So I'll leave you on one last note of optimism. We can turn to questions. This is a great quote from a very well-known legal scholar from 1944, that where liberty lies in the hearts of men and women, when it dies there, there's no constitution, no law, no court that can save it. But while it lies there, it doesn't need any of those things either. So I continue to believe that we will be fine as a country, but there's a lot to be concerned about too.
Wow, Alan, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. I wish we had literally an hour for Q&A after the hour of conversation, or 45 minutes that we've had. So many important questions. I'm gonna snake my role and opportunity to ask a few questions off the top, hitting on a couple of other questions that people asked in the chat as well. Can you talk, I'm gonna give you 3 questions. I'm gonna try and do it quickly so that you can speak most of the time. 1, can you talk about the concept of the splinter net and the degree to which a Biden or a Trump administration is going to continue the balkanization of the internet with regard to India banning TikTok, Trump banning, then allowing the sale of TikTok to Oracle, the banning of WeChat, and are we going to see a Chinese internet and an Indian internet and an American internet? What does that mean for the globe to be able to collaborate on pressing world issues if everybody has a different sense of reality? We already have a different sense of reality with everybody on the same platforms. What happens if everybody's on different platforms? And then we have to talk about the climate crisis. 2, how could we learn, how could federal privacy legislation in the United States learn from the mistakes of GDPR, whether they be the stringency reducing investigative journalism or impacting scientific research and genetic research specifically, or putting a bit of a tie of hands around machine learning style businesses, et cetera. And 3, does the US meddle in geopolitics through social media like we accuse Russia of doing to us? Does the US clandestinely get on social media to affect geopolitical outcomes in Africa or Southeast Asia, et cetera? Give us the real scoop.
Those are awesome. Okay, very quickly. Splinternet. I think you will see a move to really address that, particularly in the Biden administration or a Democratic Senate. I think I don't know that it's been explicitly part of anybody's platform, but Vice President Biden is a person who believes in the multilateral, the Westphalian order. If you look at historically how the Obama administration looked at these things, we had then, and I think there would be, an appreciation for the problems that data localization brings, the problems that protectionism with it, favoring one company. This is exactly the problem we face in China, and we're fighting against it. We shouldn't be doing it here. And so I think you'll see a very different approach to those kinds of issues about how do we treat particular companies, and a pushback among some of our allies to say, look, we do not want to create this splinter net. The beauty of the internet has been that it is a platform that we can all use. And, we have big problems we need to see solved together. And so I think you'll see a lot more of that. It's probably one of the biggest kind of philosophical differences that you'll see between these 2 candidates out there. On privacy, this is it's a great question, and things about what we can learn from the GDPR, because there are things, GDPR is not at all a perfect piece of rulemaking. And we I think do have a very different approach to things like the right to be forgotten, which is kind of anathema to our, right to remember, our ability to speak freely. And as somebody who comes out of who lives in Washington and comes out of the government world, we need your help all of you on this call. I mean, there's such a need for greater understanding. These are very complex systems. You know, a lot of unintended consequences sometimes when we do these rules, set up these rules. And I think, you know, I've appreciated IDE's role as a leader, and we just need more of it. So thank you for your time today, and thanks for having me.
Awesome. I just want to remind everyone, thank you very much, Alan. That was fantastic. We really appreciate you being here. I just want to remind everyone that next Wednesday's IDE seminar will be Moore Nauman from Cornell. Fantastic information researcher. He's going to talk about perceptions of AI and its impact on trustworthiness in AI-mediated communication. That should be incredibly amazing. Moore is a fantastic researcher and a great person to talk to about those topics. So we will see you next week. Thanks, everybody.